Hey students, this is Professor Gore, and in this recorded lecture, we're going to be covering Reagan's second term in office. And so a lot of this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about his foreign policy and so forth, both successes and failures. So one of the things that you'll see is Reagan and his head of the Federal Reserve Board, which is Paul Volcker, tried to curtail inflation. And one of the ways that they did that is they raised interest rates. And this is a time period that I remember my parents always talking about that they had car loans that were as high as 18%. And so you can look at the interest rates. This was right during that time and so forth. So interest rates were bad. And especially if you were trying to buy a home and so forth, and that affects your monthly payment big time. And so they were trying to cut inflation. As a result, it ended up leading to a recession. And so and it put about some 10 million Americans out of work, and Reagan's approval rating is going to go down and so forth as a result. And typically when the economy is not great, you're going to see that the other party will pick up seats, and the Democrats pick up about 26 seats in the House and 7 governorships in 1982. But nonetheless, the economy and Reagan's popularity revived. And so in the election of 1984, okay, so after the economy kind of rebounded a little bit, Reagan is going to square off against Walter Mondale, a prominent Democratic congressman, and then Geraldine Ferraro, who had been the first woman, and this is significant, first woman ever voted in as a vice presidential candidate of a major party. Now, she didn't win the vice presidency because Walter Mondale loses the election, but nonetheless, that's significant. And you see how the feminist movement post-World War II, that's a big success. And then later, we'll see that Hillary Clinton will be the first our first female presidential candidate of a major party. You did have Shirley Chisholm that ran as a third-party candidate and so forth in the previous decade, but Hillary Clinton was the first major female candidate of a major party and so forth. So Walter Mondale was from Minnesota, and what ends up happening is Reagan's going to win every state except Minnesota, which is where Walter Mondale was from, and also D.C. Still, though, Democrats retain the majority in the House, and in 1986 regain control of the Senate. So Reagan's going to be battling a Democrat-controlled Congress, much like Nixon and Ford did as well. So you look right here. In terms of the Electoral College, Reagan is even going to win bigger than he did against Jimmy Carter in 1980 election. Now, let's look at one of the foreign policy failures of Reagan, then we're going to get to his greatest success of his time in office in his foreign policy with the IMF treaty. So the Iran-Contra affair is probably one of the most complex things I teach on each year. And so when I teach on it in U.S. and world history classes, I have to explain it several times for kids to understand, or really not just kids, but that's high school, but also college students as well, because it is confusing. So let's kind of put everything in context. We'll be talking about 3 different parts of the world, and I'm going to explain how each of those parts are connected. Okay, so let's look at Central America. Then we're going to go to Lebanon, and then we're going to go to Iran. And then I'm going to explain how all 3 of those connected through this issue. So in Nicaragua, a communist group has seized power, and Carter actually supported them because Jimmy Carter, his policy was, I'm going to support who I think is the best government, whether they're communist or not. And so he supported the left-wing Sandinistas. But there was a group of rebels who were fighting against them called the Contras. Now, Reagan had wanted to support the Contra rebels in their fight against the communist Sandinistas, because Reagan was a Cold War warrior, which I'll cover a little bit in a minute. And so Congress, though, fresh off of what had happened in the decade before with the Vietnam War, they didn't want to start sending military aid. That's what got us started in Vietnam in the 1950s, and we end up getting sucked into there. And so it's because of the legacy of Vietnam that Congress was like, no way, Jose, we're not going to support that. So Congress basically tells the president, you can't send military aid or money and so forth to help the Contra rebels. So that's what happens in that's the context of Nicaragua. Now let's go to Lebanon. Okay. In Lebanon, what you end up having is Israel had been fighting the Palestinian Liberation Organization. This has been a group that had been fighting Israel to try to create a separate Palestinian state. And they had been, actually kind of supported by Iran and other Middle Eastern groups, and fired rockets periodically at Israel. Well, Israel had kind of gone into their kind of base of operations in the West Bank, and kind of they fled, and they end up going to Lebanon. And so in Lebanon, they began firing rockets into northern Israel from there. Well, Lebanon is a country that's got about half Muslim, half Christian population, and relatively peaceful country. But Israel, to stop their getting rockets fired at them, they invade Lebanon. One of the groups that they end up fighting, besides the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is also called Hezbollah. Hezbollah is they're recognized by the UN as a terrorist organization, but they're Palestinians, and they're backed by Iran at this time, because you remember the Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution had been very anti the United States and so forth. Well, Hezbollah had taken hostages, particularly American hostages, journalists in Lebanon. In fact, I read a great book when I was in college called From Beirut to Jerusalem about this conflict. It was actually from a New York Times journalist that covered this. In fact, his apartment got blown up by terrorists trying to kill him and his family, and thankfully him and his family were not there. And so that's what's happening in Lebanon. So you got hostages being held by Hezbollah terrorist organization in Lebanon. All right, now let's go to Iran. Let's go to the third region. I'm going to explain how they're all connected. So in Iran, in the 1980s, the country of Iraq invades Iran. Okay, the reason why they invade them is Saddam Hussein is leader of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, and he is a Sunni Muslim who the Sunnis make up the minority population against the Shiites, but they kind of oppress the Shiites along with the Kurds. But they invade Iran for two reasons. One, Saddam Hussein feared that this radical Shiite revolution from Iran will spill into Iraq, and his majority Shiite population will overthrow him. Secondly, he saw Iran as weak, and he thought, well, he could kind of create a Middle Eastern empire. Iraq had the fourth largest military in the world at that time. So he invades. He also documented the use of chemical weapons against the Iranians. And so the United States, on paper probably would have supported Iraq because Iran was so anti the United States. So here's where things get, how they all get connected. Okay. Some U.S. military personnel sold missiles to Iran. Okay. Now, why in the world would they sell missiles to a country that hates us? Now, they didn't give them to them. They sold them. All right. They did this, okay, for two reasons. One, to get Iran to convince Hezbollah to release the hostages held in Lebanon, okay, because Iran had backed Hezbollah. Okay. Iran actually does that. The American hostages are released. Secondly, they take the money from the missile sales and take it all the way to Central America and give it to the Contra rebels fighting in Nicaragua, which Congress said you couldn't do. So they didn't create new money to give to the Contras. They took existing money from the sale of these missiles and get them to release the hostages in Lebanon and then give them to the Contra rebels. So let's explain this again. Okay. The United States sold missiles to Iran, a country that hated us, and their war against Iraq, to get them to pressure Hezbollah, a terrorist organization that they supported, to release American hostages held in Lebanon, which they do. Then they take the money that they made from the missile sales and give them to the Contra rebels, who were fighting a communist government in Nicaragua led by the Sandinistas, which Congress had said that they were not allowed to do that. And so what ends up happening is it breaks into the press, and Reagan administration's under some heat. Now, Reagan claimed that he did not know about this, but he said it was a kind of a brilliant political strategist move. He claims that he didn't know about it, but that he should have, and takes blame for that, but didn't take blame for actually ordering it. Now, so they tried to make the fall guy be Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. And so he testifies before Congress, but Oliver North, he gets acquitted. The reason why is he showed that he had documented evidence that he was ordered to do this. Okay, it wasn't like he did this roguely. He was ordered to do this from somewhere in the White House. Okay, so it didn't tie back directly to Reagan, but it tied to somebody in Reagan's administration, and they weren't able to figure out who, and so nobody actually was punished for this, and Oliver North gets acquitted. And so it does hurt Reagan's legacy. Okay, now we're going to get to the IMF treaty here in just a minute, and that's going to be Reagan's greatest foreign policy achievement. So let's look at some things, though, that about Reagan's legacy. One is the Iran-Contra affair, which is not good. Secondly, is he added nearly $2 trillion to the national debt. Okay, but let's look at other things. He was able to appoint 3 conservatives to the Supreme Court, so the right side of the country would have supported that. He also appointed the first female Supreme Court judge in American history, was Sandra Day O'Connor. He's not able to overturn Roe versus Wade, which had legalized abortion. He's not able to cut some of the social programs that he was wanting to because he's dealing with mostly a Democrat-controlled Congress. Okay. In fact, Antonin Scalia, a famous conservative judge, actually died just in the last couple of years. And then Anthony Kennedy is just retired, and Judge Brett Kavanaugh replaced him. If you've been following the news, that has been quite controversial. And Sandra Day O'Connor has long retired, and in fact, I think her health is not doing too well. So let's talk about a couple of things during Reagan's presidency as well, and that is the savings and loans crisis. Okay, this wasn't really anything with Reagan, but this is just what's happening at the time. The federal budget deficit and international trade deficit made things worse. Banks suffered from bad loans to third world countries and falling oil prices slashed real estate values in the Southwest and undermined hundreds of savings and loans institutions. These were types of banks at the time. The government had to help them out, and it cost about $500 billion in doing so, similar to the bailout that happens in the 2008 recession when President Obama bails them out. More banks and savings institutions were folding than any time since the Great Depression. In fact, on Black Monday, October 19, 1987, the leading stock market index plunged 508 points, and so forth. Now, that is definitely not going to lead to a Great Depression. Otherwise, we would be talking about that. We had some more safety nets put in place, and so forth. But basically, what was happening is these banks, these saving loans institutions, were giving loans to these really high-priced real estate deals in southwestern part of the United States, particularly where they thought there was oil and stuff. And when these real estate values plummeted and they couldn't sell them for what the loan was, then these banks had bad loans and they were about to go under. And so the federal government ended up bailing them out. A lot of critics at the time was like, why are you bailing out these banks when they made bad business deals? They should go under, and so forth. You see a similar argument when the 2008 recession happens and you have the bailout in 2009. All right, let's talk about Reagan's foreign policies, more of his success. So Reagan took a much stronger stance against the Soviet Union than a lot of presidents really before him. He referred to them as the evil empire. And so in his first term, he hammers them in his speeches and so forth, and wants to negotiate only with the Soviet Union from a position of overwhelming strength, which is why he builds up the military. And the Soviet Union tries to match that military spending, and they just can't, because the Soviet economy is faltering, because a communist economy is not near as strong as a capitalist economy. That's been historical. There's been numerous historical evidence that has demonstrated that throughout the last 100 years or so. And so, but what ends up happening is Reagan actually is going to be willing to negotiate with the Soviet Union in a second term. Okay, and so let's look at what ends up happening with that. And so Reagan is going to abandon détente. There's going to be a new arms race, but eventually this Cold War is going to speed to an end. He also tried to help fund guerrillas to overthrow pro-communist governments in Angola, Mozambique, also Afghanistan, and Central America. And so he was trying to kind of like the United States foreign policy in the 1950s. We're going to support countries, whether they have good leadership or not, as long to support the overthrow of communism or prevent the spread of communism there, kind of like the Truman and Eisenhower doctrines. Okay, but the Soviet economy, what's really happening is it's crumbling from within. So kind of like George F. Kennan had predicted back in the 1940s, that if you just contain the spread of communism, eventually it will crumble from within. keep it from spreading. And that's exactly what happens in the 1980s. And people were so shocked when this actually played out between 1989 and 1991, but it was beginning to happen in the 80s. Because without this fair market competition and so forth, the Soviet Union is not able to compete with innovation and research and economically. And the Eastern European countries in the Soviet Union had a much lower standard of living than the capitalistic nations. And so, but really what changes things is the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev is personally one of my favorite world leaders of the 20th century, just because he was a reasonable guy in a country that oftentimes had been unreasonable. And of course, at times the United States had been unreasonable too during the Cold War. But what ends up happening is Leonid Brezhnev ends up retiring or dying. And then there was a guy who replaced Brezhnev, but then he ended up resigning because of poor health and died soon after. And so Mikhail Gorbachev, a younger guy, kind of rises to prominence. And he decides to pull the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan in 1988. Here is Mikhail Gorbachev. You can always remember him because of the birthmark on his forehead. But he's a former nuclear physicist or nuclear scientist, brilliant guy. And one of the things that he introduced to the Soviet Union, which was revolutionary for the time and something you had not seen since even back in the Tsar days, is what's called glasnost. It means openness. And then also perestroika, which is restructuring of the Soviet economy. So what he does is he doesn't allow free speech entirely in the Soviet Union. No way, Jose. But he allows some open criticism of the government. So because the Soviet bureaucracy had really gotten so big, inefficient, out of hand. And so it was going to allow some criticism so that we could try to fix this. Okay, so Gorbachev's a reasonable guy. Also, perestroika, he doesn't get rid of communism, but he allows some, okay, the key word is there's some free market practices. Okay? He's not going to go to a total free market economy, but he's going to allow some free market practices so that way the Soviet Union can be more competitive economically. A lot of the old communist Soviet hardliners hated Gorbachev for this. And so Reagan and Gorbachev met a series of 3 different times, beginning in late 1985, beginning in 1986. And then their third meeting in 1987, they end up coming up with the INF Treaty. Okay. And what's that INF Treaty is, it bans all intermediate range nuclear missiles, okay, out of Europe. Now, does it overall really reduce the nuclear arsenals of both countries? Not really. But what it does is it shows an end or an easing of Cold War tensions, kind of like back in détente in the early 1970s. And it's really great for the world. And it's great for both Eastern and Western Europe and so forth. And so they met 3 different times. And I one time listened to a guy who talked to President Reagan about this. He was like, President Reagan, were you intimidated to be talking to Soviet Premier Gorbachev because here he is, you're talking about nuclear weapons, and here he is, a nuclear scientist and so forth. And he's like, oh, how? He didn't know that stuff either. Well, Reagan, what he lacked in knowledge, he made up for in confidence. And Reagan actually acted like he wasn't going to compromise the whole time. And so trying to get Gorbachev to budge, which Gorbachev does budge. And then at the last minute, Reagan compromised and gave Gorbachev more of what he wanted. So it kind of left the negotiating deal of both parties feeling like they got a good deal out of it. But really, I give Gorbachev a lot of credit because Gorbachev was willing to compromise first. And it takes somebody who's willing to compromise first to make that deal happen. It's a big deal. Both of them win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1987. And so Reagan is the second president in American history to win the Nobel Peace Prize, Teddy Roosevelt being the first, and then President Obama will be the third. And so that's a big deal. And so that happens in 1987. And then 2 years later, when it begins in late 1989, countries start falling to communism. Okay, that means communism starts falling. The first one is Poland and East Germany. Okay, now Pope John Paul II, a famous Catholic pope in the 20th century, was actually from Poland and really was instrumental in helping trying to end communism there. But really, what starts the end of communism in Poland is a labor movement. Okay, and a labor movement of these dock workers and so forth. And they began pushing for more free elections. and eventually Poland grants it. And when you start having free elections, you can start ending communism. Um, and so the Berlin Wall, it fell in November of 1989 because East Germany citizens began pushing for that. And word had gotten out in November of 1989 that the East German guards would not stop people who crossed the thing. And then one night, as people stood on the Berlin Wall, eventually they started taking sledgehammers and bringing it down. And you see that within the next year, East Germany unites with West Germany. In fact, East Germany was so poor, it almost caused a major depression in Germany when West Germany absorbed them. That's how poor they were under communism. And so the Soviet Union doesn't collapse until 1991. The reason why it collapsed is they tried to have a coup against Gorbachev, who was vacationing down in southern Russia. And Boris Yeltsin, who was a friend of his, alerted him, and he was able to dodge it from these old Soviet hardliners. But eventually Gorbachev resigns, and these other countries who had been controlled by the Soviet Union wanted their independence, plus Russia was really, of the Soviet Union, was really the only economically decent country at the, well, I should say stronger country. They got tired of kind of flipping the bill for all the poor Soviet republics. And so they want to break his way as well. And so Boris Yeltsin ends up becoming the first president of Russia. And so you have a commonwealth of independent states that form and so forth. Now we're going to get to the communism officially falling under the presidency of George H.W. Bush, which I'll cover